Awesome. Thanks, everyone. As Jesse said, my name is Tyler Rockhill. I'm a senior river engineer with Cramer Fish Sciences. And I'm going to present today on integrating watershed context to inform process-based restoration, some lessons from the Upper Grand Ronde. This work was completed in collaboration with my colleagues Zach DeLuca, Phil Roney, and Kai Ross. It was prepared for the Grand Ronde Model Watershed in collaboration with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, with funding provided by Bonneville Power Administration. Since I'm the last one before lunch, how many of you have you all used a watershed assessment at some point in your career to help prioritize or plan for projects? Quite a few. So really the focus of this talk is how we really leverage those watershed assessments to make sure that the quality and quantity of the data, it helps inform restoration decisions. So as I said, the purpose of this study is to take a snapshot of the watershed conditions, aquatic habitat, geomorphology, riparian ecology within some of the major drainages for the Upper Grand Ronde River. And this serves to develop a suite of metrics to help compare potential natural conditions, reference analogs, and evaluate lessons learned for future restoration projects. Additionally, the set of metrics we hope will act as a framework, and would like to make these data available all to help you all test theories, hypotheses, novel methodologies, and other potential impacts. This presentation is separated into three different components. The first will focus on reviewing methods for the watershed habitat metric development, as well as some of the results. And then we'll really shift to how we kind of put these in place and integrate ecological, geomorphic and land use history factors that really impact the perception of numerical quantification methods. And then third, we're going to evaluate some benchmarks from additional studies outside and inside the basin to see where some of these results fall within other reference conditions. So most of you are already familiar with this study focuses on the Upper Grand Ronde River. So that's BSRs 17 through 20. And this watershed is really well suited for this type of analysis because it includes a wide range of different reach types, ranging from steeper forested systems to low gradient meadows. It also has kind of a wide range of degradation mechanisms from logging to splash damming, grazing, dredge mining, timber harvest, erosion development. And then there's a fantastic compendium of the prior projects completed within the basin that's compiled by the Grand Ronde Model Watershed. By our counts, we could be a little bit off. We counted 66 documented projects within this area. We noted a couple of kind of larger ones within in the list on the slides. And yeah, and then the map presenting the kind of geospatial distribution of those. And just kind of some context, this is a really critical stream for summer steelhead, spring chinook, and bull trout, as well as other aquatic organisms. So our detailed habitat and aquatic metrics framework, really, we wanted to borrow from the Castro and Thorne stream triangle. So focusing on those three pinnacles, hydrology, ecology, and geology, to help organize and provide a framework for the habitat assessment. And then overlaying on top of that is the biological component. So we have 10 metrics related to this that ranges from FDAT, juvenile capacity, habitat suitability, spawning data, ecological metrics predominantly focused on the role of beaver, riparian and floodplain vegetation, and large wood. And then 15 metrics for geomorphology, ranging from gradient, confinement, and substrate, and additionally a more detailed hydrologic analysis. So I don't expect anyone to be able to read this. Oh, last one. Yeah, perfect. I don't expect anyone to be able to read this, but you all, as you have worked with watershed assessments in the past, have probably seen some table like this, right? A bunch of reaches in the columns and a bunch of metrics in the rows. And it's really helpful to have all these data, but we're getting to the point where sort of the cognitive load of understanding what the implications of these are reached. So the first thing that we really wanted to do was kind of tear into those metrics and figure out if we have a strong degree of correlation and that we could reduce that total cognitive load and look at correlated factors that we could potentially remove or that aren't providing any additional information to the watershed assessment. So the table on the right just shows the linear correlation for all those metrics that I just talked about related to themselves, which I think is a key step that's missing from a lot of watershed assessments, is integrating and then sort of QA/QCing some of those relationships. So the blue indicate a strong positive relationship, and the red a strong negative relationship. And we'll go over a couple critical examples here. And obviously, this is just kind of the first cut, simple linear relationships, but there's probably much more complicated statistical analysis that could be performed. So, a couple of quick examples. The chart on the left is just showing the habitat composition in terms of percent pool in green, percent riffle in orange, and percent glide in purple for the four creeks and individual reaches within those creeks. So, you can see the range of variability between chicken, limberjam, sheep, and upper Grand Ronde based on the number of independent reaches within those areas. On the upper right, we have a similar thing for riparian class understory. This is the density of that riparian class, right? We can see that we're testing within this watershed a range of different densities of riparian vegetation. And then I wanted to mention the large wood chart on the lower right. We did go through the basin and sort of update some of the older surveys to include changes based on recent restoration projects. Most notable one, we've got Woodley as that far outlier in the large wood per 100 meters, really ramping up the wood density chart. So this is just an example of some of those metrics on the prior sheet, and the rest of this presentation will really focus on how do we correlate them with their similar metrics. So one of the critical elements that we recommend introducing is more detailed hydrologic analysis. And I think as others mentioned before today, right, climate change is not just a confounding factor. It is here and already present. And finding out how to simplify the integration of climate change into restoration design and planning. Particularly, we looked at change in trend detection and non-stationarity analysis for the Upper Grand Ronde River below Clear Creek gauge. And a couple of really interesting things. So this I know is probably a little bit small for the folks in the back, but essentially we took the annual gauge for the Upper Grand Ronde and we analyzed the change that we could evaluate in the annual hydrograph and then break it into its seasonal constituents. And we looked at these for kind of key hydrologic metrics such as 7-day minimum flow, mean annual flow, and 1-day maximum flow. Um, and so, for example, right, we can see that relative to the annual change and slope for 7-day minimum flow, the annual kind of blurs out the efficacy or the signal from these particular seasonal components, such as a stronger relationship in the fall for 7-day minimum flows, which obviously has a implication on spawning availability as well as riparian vegetation recruitment. When we turn our attention to the winter, we see a much stronger relationship with the 1-day maximum flows, which is going to be related to your gravel transport rates, your meander rates, and some of those more geomorphic processes. Looking at the spring, again, a relatively similar but stronger relationship relative to the mean annual hydrograph for the mean annual flow and the 1-day maximums. And again, this is going to be predominantly related to that riparian succession component. Similarly to the fall, we see that the decrease in summer flow is more strongly amplified when we just look at the summer constituent. The next part includes non-stationarity and change point detection. So we analyzed the gauge uh, for its entire period of record, looking for base flow, low flow, and high flow change points. And we identified two change points that you can see here in 1997 and 2008, and these were both high flow change points. And hydrologic data is complicated because it's always confounded by large scale climatic factors that were already mentioned today, such as PDO and ENSO, and that's most likely what is observed in the gauge record at this location. And on the right, we see some annual trends where we added some slope estimates. So almost a 4% increase year over year for maximum daily flow, about a 0.5% decrease year over year for median daily, and a 1% decrease for 30-day minimum flow. Um, in the gauge record. And then we're keeping those charts on the right and shifting over to on the left here, we have downscaled climate change predictions from the variable infiltration capacity model produced by the UW Climate Impacts Group. And this is based on 2080 projections from the relative concentration pathway 8.5. And overall, what we really wanted to do with this particular analysis was say, we've observed some change in the gauge record. Is this corroborated by the predictions in these large scale climatic models? And overall, pick a particular metric, whether it's maximum daily, we could look at the mean winter flow or the number of winter floods, or any of the recurrence interval flows, and we see generally the same sort of trend direction. Similar with median daily, whether we look at mean flow year round, we see a slight decrease over projected over time. And then similarly with 30-day minimums, whether you're looking at, summer or fall low flow or 1 year minimum weekly flows, where we're seeing a similar general direction. But as I mentioned before, hydrology in particular is really easy to develop a long list and a large suite of metrics. And so our recommendations for this are really to try to synthesize those data and to come up with a few key points that we can make actionable decisions based off of. And the first recommendation is that change in date of flow center mass. This is really gonna, have significant bearing on the periodicity, um, and indication of basin regime changes. And then for low flows, whether you use the 7-day low flow or the 7-day 10-year, it doesn't necessarily matter as much as long as you're getting that change in direction. Um, and then similarly, on the high flow end, you want some sort of metric that's going to indicate that 1-day maximum or change in bankful or change in 100-year, as it's really going to have a strong bearing on the geomorphic state of that reach, as well as risk to infrastructure. One of the other components, and this is from some prior work for the Upper Grand Ronde River Partnership, is habitat suitability analysis that we performed over the Upper Grand Ronde River. And again, this is a very helpful tool for testing hypotheses um, and and um, and theories related to habitat suitability. And so for this, we analyzed habitat suitability for Chinook, steelhead, redband, and lamprey over spawning adult and juvenile life stages using a variety of curves. And this resulted in over 2,000 independent habitat suitability calculations, um, which were very helpful in sort of defining and then simplifying some of the habitat characteristics. This relied substantially on a calibrated 2D hydraulic model, which is also available for the entirety of the watershed. This model was calibrated to over 1,000 paired observations of depth and velocity throughout the Upper Grand Ronde. On the right, we can see the observed velocity relative to simulated velocity on the y-axis for the calibration transects. And on the bottom chart is a box and whisker plot for the comparing the simulated depth to the observed depth. And overall, velocity is typically much more difficult to calibrate to. We observed a 0.2% bias for our depth calibration with a mean error of 0 feet, and 5.2% bias in the velocity calibration with a mean error of 0.07 feet. And this gives us a spatially distributed result for depth and velocity over the entire watershed, which was used to inform many of these metrics. Additionally, a little bit different, we completed a kind of similar but parallel assessment for substrate mapping using random forest and machine learning models. And this resulted in a prediction of median substrate classification that's geospatially represented um, throughout the entire watershed. And the primary variables that the random forest model predicted were, as we would expect, velocity, slope, topographical roughness index, and the velocity at low flow. Now we compared and contrasted pebble count data all throughout the Upper Grand Ronde to kind of validate the machine learning model predictions. So here's just a longitudinal profile of the Upper Grand Ronde River, showing the D16 in orange, D50 in blue, and D84 in gray. And then the X shows the predictions of our random forest model. And you can see for the most part, in 9 out of 10 cases, the random forest model is predicting somewhere around that D50 range for median substrate class. There are a couple instances through like middle upper Grand Ronde as the substrate gets larger that the predictions tend to get a little larger as well. I performed similar analysis for cover mapping, differentiating the LiDAR into its constituent components, such as undercut banks, overhanging vegetation, and terrestrial grasses, as well as large wood. But kind of want to focus on a more detailed riparian assessment. Um, where we broke down the LiDAR classification into 3 particular classes that are meant to represent different forest-specific constituents. So the understory is between 0 and 1.5 meters. This was intended to represent some of the meadow grasses. Middle story between 1.5 and 3 meters, meant to represent some of those willow and shrub components. Then the overstory meant to represent the conifer forest. Um, and then additionally, for each of these watersheds, we calculated riparian density and diversity based on light penetration index and standard deviation of canopy height. So now getting to some of the results and some of the, the focus of the study was to use these mathematical correlations as extensions of our common sense understanding. And the first one we wanted to look at is comparing some juvenile rearing metrics, which leverage the FDOT juvenile density predictions to the habitat suitability analysis that I just talked about. And very interesting, almost no correlation between these two factors. And on first glance, this could be a little alarming. However, when you really dive into what these are trying to tell you, you can see that there's two different sides of the same coin that these can be used for, right? FDAT is much more watershed scale, whereas habitat suitability is really focused on the mesohabitat characteristics. When we look at other juvenile factors, we're again trying to use our common sense and our understanding to evaluate if the trends that we predict are visible. So again, looking at FDAT juvenile predictions and HSI for Chinook rearing, we evaluated those against the percent pool habitat. Riparian understory, as we anticipate that some of these wide, well-connected meadows might be beneficial rearing habitat. And then riparian class overstory. And again, not a whole lot of correlation here, except for with the percent pool habitat and habitat suitability. On the spawning side of things, again, we're taking some of the conceptually predominant elements such as percent riffle and glide and relating them to mean annual density for reds, as well as habitat suitability for Chinook spawning. And very interestingly, seeing a relatively strong negative correlation between habitat suitability index and mean annual red density. And obviously this is because habitat suitability represents potential and not actualized habitat. Um, but again, relatively weak correlations indicating that sort of mismatch in scale between some of the larger reach breakdowns and the mesohabitat information. Geomorphic factors, as I mentioned in the beginning, we had over 15 geomorphic metrics, which is obviously kind of a high cognitive load component, and we really wanted to look at whether we could pull out specific elements that we could use to represent a large suite of metrics, rather than having a laundry list of individual components to look at. In this case, geomorphology and some of these geomorphic metrics did a very good job at correlating to their kind of ecosystem environment. So we can see as valley width decreases, we can demonstrate that change from those steeper, more narrow and confined forested basins to the wider meadows. And similarly, sinuosity is a good proxy for pool habitat. Additionally, we are looking at the ecological components of beaver, and specifically using the Bratt Beaver Capacity Index and its correlation to other habitat components. And the first thing, we saw a strong correlation between canopy cover and mean August stream temperature, which, is good, as well as large wood recruitment. So again, some of these metrics that maybe we don't need to duplicate in our watershed prioritization and assessment. We did expect to see kind of a different relationship between habitat suitability and beaver. And again, one is representing potential and one is representing actual conditions, which is likely the justification for this deviation. We can see that metrics such as river complexity index correlate fairly well with beaver capacity. Although we were expecting to see a stronger relationship between riparian density and predicted beaver capacity, this is again similarly, demonstrating the potential habitat versus the current habitat. And then finally, we wanted to kind of bring this all back to some of the atlas metrics, and so looking at some of the typical scores from the atlas, being current temperature score, or temperature score, periodicity score, habitat and geomorphic score. And overall, we saw a relatively good relationship between the temperature score and reduced temperatures. So those lower temperatures have a higher score for. However, note that in particular, for example, in Sheep Creek, right, we maybe didn't get the level of specificity for some of the upper reaches because of the lumping into these larger BSRs, and we see some deviation within these categories. Additionally, the periodicity scores or relates to the temperature score is quite interesting in that they're almost perfectly correlated. So we're not really getting a whole lot of additional information from one or the other of those. We did see a negative correlation between the use score and the mean annual red density, as well as the Chinook density predictions. Um, and again, this has to do with kind of potential versus actual habitat. In terms of the geomorphic potential rating, we see, this was highly effective at breaking down these different floodplain and in-stream characterizations. Um, and then the last thing to note is specifically within the Upper Grand Ronde. Next, thank you. Um, we looked at the habitat condition score and geomorphic potential rating and noticed that they're simply inverse, right? So another example of where we might be able to squeeze a little bit more information with different characterization of either of these two habitat scores. Now we're going to shift to some context and knowing that it's a very difficult task to synthesize this wide range of degradation mechanisms, as well as a wide range of ecological settings, right? Those steeper forested basins down to the open wide meadows. And additionally, we're really trying to capture a potential breakdown in these fine scale processes in a very upscaled and watershed level approach. Um, and so, really, this is kind of the importance of this talk is to figure out how we can find the small number of factors that give us the most information about these particular characteristics. And then also just indicating that we're just taking a snapshot within time, and there's a natural uh, variability in the input and fluxes for uh, flow, sediment, and large wood that create a very variable river corridor. Um, that needs to be considered when we're kind of talking about reference conditions. So one of the things that we leveraged in this study and wanted to kind of present some potential alternatives is the Wells et al. Riparian vegetation mapping study. And this provided us, riparian vegetation is one of the harder things to kind of tease apart in terms of natural or potential historic conditions because unlike, development and roads and culverts, there's no substantial mark on the landscape that's nearly as clear as in those more physical conditions. And so this study kind of lends a very unique glance on potential historic vegetation, and we wanted to kind of mark some potential alternatives for basins that don't have this high level of detail. And those could be potentially land fire using their quantitative disturbance measure or site tree potential um, as a proxy for this detailed study that was completed in the Upper Grand Ronde. And secondly, we just wanted to take a moment to mention that the importance of reach classifications came up over and over in the study. Although these might introduce some bias, they're also a very helpful conceptual tool for conveying a large amount of information between partners and practicing individuals, such as their geomorphic or ecologic function, and remain a very important contextual tool for watershed assessments. And now we're going to kind of transition and talk about some of the analysis we did related to reference conditions for, in particular, two components, those being large wood and pools. And so for large wood conditions, right, we see a lot of the literature that focuses on bankful width, stream order, and slope, and really want to focus on shifting to a more context-focused targets, such as potential natural vegetation, recruitment potential, or vegetation departure, rather than some of these fixed entities. Although it's important to note that, a recent study, Aquafor et al., 2024, did indicate that, using fixed targets can be ineffective for managing large wood. And that's again due to the continual flux over time for large wood. So we evaluated five different reference condition citations, those being reach-based ecosystem indicators, which are used throughout the Upper Columbia and other places. Some reference conditions from ODF and W, study from Gregory et al. 2023, in the Yankee Fork watershed and Fox and Bolton, and then some preliminary data that Seth White helped compile for champ sites. And overall, right, we can see that when we break these two categories, when we break all these reference conditions into their predominant characterizing factor, which was bankful width, we don't get a whole lot of information about where these might tend to fall. So a potential alternative might look more like utilizing the potential natural vegetation to help break these up into more of a meadow or a transitional or a forested subreach, rather than looking at bankful width or reach type. Additionally, we use some of the same sources, so reach-based ecosystem indicators, ODF and W, Montgomery et al., and Montgomery Buffington, and that preliminary data from Seth White to look at common indicators from pool density. And again, right, specifically for these small streams, we see a huge range of variability that isn't very helpful in making restoration reference condition decisions. Uh, Instead, we might utilize a more reach-based classification framework to help break down this chart into helping to define reference or target conditions. So overall, we often don't have a very good glimpse of the historic conditions and that wide range of degradation mechanisms might alter that stream to its current state. And then a wide range of components from hydrologic, geomorphic, and ecologic regimes might kind of pull and push the potential trajectory of that reach based on a number of different factors. And then ultimately, these come together and are synthesized by restoration feasibility constraints and other factors to set the trajectory into potential future restored conditions based on restoration feasibility. So, in conclusion, right, we really want to make sure that the metrics that we're using for these watershed assessments is focused on quality over quantity. It's the analyzing the correlation of these metrics can really help reduce the cognitive load and provide a streamlined approach for watershed assessments. And then it's really critical not to forget the importance of that professional judgment balanced with the quantitative measure to help inform um, watershed assessments. And then for the ecological context, right, we have to recognize that we're looking at one small snapshot in time that's highly variable, and as well as has been impacted by historic and current channel morphologies. So focusing on an approach that covers the range of degradation mechanisms as well as the range of potential historic conditions. And then likely noting that reference conditions are often available. And so reach classification and fuzzy logic can really help to fill in some of the research gaps so that we can move forward with a high level of understanding and produce quality watershed assessments that provide actionable data for watershed planners and restoration practitioners. And that is all I have. Thank you all for listening. And yeah, I'll take time for questions.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks a lot for that. And when you notice that there is a decrease in 30-day minimum flows and an increase in maximum flows, did you do any correlation with precipitation distribution?
Sorry, the last part of that question.
With precipitation distribution.
We did not kind of dive into the precipitation distribution. We did look at sort of those large scale climatic factors as they related to summer low flow and then 30-day maximum. And we are noting the influence of PDO and ENSO in shifting those over time. The gauge record is just sort of starting to be long enough to pick apart in a statistically significant manner some of those components. But we didn't look at specific storm precipitation based events.
All right. Thanks, Tyler. I'm curious i- if you've gone through the process of compiling all the available habitat data that's been collected by Champ and CRIPFIC and ODFW and the Forest Service and populated like a map that breaks it down by biologically significant reach and compares that with these kind of target values that you're talking about. It sounds like that's what you've done, but I wasn't entirely clear. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think we have most of that well compiled, and that was part of the hope of this study is to, almost provide a little sandbox for testing some of these hypotheses or theories. In that, we've got the data compiled for a reach that we understand well, and that we have a large amount of existing data for. Um, and and some of this was and in looking at those reference conditions, as you asked, did we evaluate the BSRs based on those? Some of this was kind of reflecting on what reference conditions mean, and whether that's an applicable. Right, we didn't find a good breakdown between, you know, large wood reference conditions for forested reaches or meadow systems, and so even performing that analysis, if you see that you have a deficiency in large wood and it happens to be, BSR 17 for Vay Ranch, uh, you know, is that really telling you what you wanna know about that particular reach or BSR?
Yeah, thank you. I think this process is going to be really helpful for the Atlas revamping process. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.